So John walks in and he tells me about the incredible psychological pain that he's feeling. And I tune into it and I feel what that's like. And then I ask him, John, why haven't you killed yourself already? And he looks at me and he says, what? I said, I just felt the tip of the iceberg of what it's like to be you. And if I was you, I would have already killed myself. So why haven't you? And he looked at me and he said, wait a minute. You don't think I'm weak? And I said, I've just tuned into just a little bit about what your life feels like. And if I felt all of it, I am telling you, I would have already killed myself. And I'm reasonably strong. So why haven't you? And then he said, well, let me get this straight. You don't think I'm weak? And I said, I'm not going to repeat myself. You are not weak. Crazy's another matter. And then he started laughing and I started laughing. And we began to turn a corner. And that's a taste of what I call surgical empathy. My name's Dr. Mark Goulston. And this is a special direct to YouTube recording of what I've learned as a suicide specialist. I was that for 35 years, and I was fortunate none of them died by suicide. But it's more than that. I'm calling this, I'm dying to tell you. And that's because I have a terminal illness. It turns out I'm not going to die anytime soon, but I'm going to be dying sooner than I thought. And I've been listening to people for 50 years. I even have a book called Just Listen, which you can see over my right shoulder. And what the universe is telling me lately is you need to share with the world what you've learned. So I was not someone who scaled what I knew because I always defaulted to one-on-one. I've written or co-written 10 books, a few bestsellers, and I never created a course. I never scaled them because I always deferred one-to-one to help people. And so I'm taking this opportunity to share with you a little or maybe a lot of what I know about suicide, why people kill themselves, and maybe how you can reach out and break through to those who are thinking of it and maybe save a life here or there. I saw suicide as very simple. I had all this training, but I have this motto that I learned from Mr. Rogers. And his motto, which he got from someone else, was try to be deep and simple instead of shallow and complex. Deep and simple instead of shallow and complex. Because when you're complex, what happens is people are just constricted. They can't take it in. They'll smile politely and nod, and then they won't do anything. So my deep and simple approach to suicide was simply, they had too much pain, too much psychological pain, too much hurt. And the only way they saw to relieve it was suicide. So death was compassionate to their pain. Death was like the sirens calling out to the sailors saying, I hear your pain. Just come up on the rocks. And what happens is people who are suicidal, they form psychological adhesions to suicide as a way to take the pain away. It's an adhesion. It's not an attachment. If it was an attachment, you might be able to reason with them, give them some insight. But when it's an adhesion, it's kind of like what happens after surgery. You know, you go in there, save someone's life with the surgery, but then some organs form adhesions. And you have to go in with what I call surgical empathy. And if you can lessen suffering that people can't live with by causing them to feel felt by you and less alone, suffering they can't live with becomes pain they can. And that's what surgical empathy is about. It's causing people to feel felt. Feeling understood is certainly helpful, but when someone is really in that deep, dark hole, in the dark night of the soul, that they can't listen to much because all they can feel is, I want the pain to go away. I can't take it anymore. And they're overwhelmed by that and they can't hear anything. And so when you treat them from the outside in, it doesn't penetrate. And then if you're fortunate enough to be able to connect with them in the dark night of the soul and break their adhesions to death, at which point they'll start crying because all they've ever been is alone there. If the hurt lessens, they begin to experience hope. And hope means they have a future. So I want to share a few things that really informed my learning this. And I'm going to share 3 anecdotes. One's called listening into people's minds, then listening into people's eyes, and then listening into people's souls. So when I was a medical student, way back when, we did something called rounds, which meant we went around and visited patients, and there would be a group of us discussing the patient and their illness and whatnot. And I had some difficulty in medical school, which I'm going to get to later. And I remember I was with this group in a veterans hospital in Boston, and we were outside, we'll call him Mr. Jones. We were outside Mr. Jones' room, and everybody was jockeying, to impress each other. One medical student said, "Oh, I think he needs surgery." Another medical student said, "Oh, I think he needs chemotherapy." And another medical student said, "I think he needs more tests." And there was then an intern and a resident who weighed in. And then the attending, was sitting there calmly about what he might need. And I was overwhelmed by this. I couldn't understand what everybody was saying because I wasn't in my dark night of the soul, but I wasn't that far away from it. And then a nurse comes over to us and she says, "Oh, didn't you hear? Mr. Jones jumped from the roof last night and he's in the morgue." Everyone goes quiet. And I am telling you, I heard a voice coming from Mr. Jones' mind, who was in the morgue. It's as loud as my voice is to you. And the voice said, maybe Mr. Jones needed something else. So that was, one story, for some reason or other, that enabled me to listen into someone's mind who was not alive anymore. The second incident is what I call listening into people's eyes. I was working at the UCLA hospital, and I was in, I believe, my residency. And I was called upon by various residents or intern to do a consultation on someone we'll call Mr. Smith. And they paged me and they said, we need to put Mr. Smith into restraints, tie down his arms and legs, because he was just pulling at them. He was pulling at the IVs. He was pulling at this respirator that was in him. He was kicking at everything on the bed. And they said, we need you to come up and okay an order for the restraints and an order for medication, an antipsychotic medicine, to stop the agitation. So I go up into the room, and there's Mr. Smith, and his eyes are as open as saucers. And he is staring at me, and he's moaning, and I'm listening, what? And he keeps going, and I say, what? And his arms were tied down, and I put a pencil in one of his hands, and I said, write it down. And he just scribbles. And what they had said is, he is psychotic. He is agitated. Just okay the restraints and the medication, And, that's what we need you to do. So I thought, well, maybe they're right. And I remember looking into his eyes and saying, we had to tie your arms and legs down and give you a medicine because you're pulling at the IVs, you're pulling at the respirator, you're kicking, at the bed. And when you calm down, we'll take everything off. And he's still yelling at me, but he can't speak because the respirator tubing is in his throat. And he goes, and then I just shrugged my shoulders. I left. A day later, I get paged. And the other doctors say, Mr. Smith is asking us to page you. So I go up into Mr. Smith's room and he grabs onto my eyes like I'm grabbing onto yours. And he's seated there. He's off the respirator. He's off the restraints. And he looks at me and he says, pull up a chair. And he seats me in the chair with his eyes. And he kept looking at me with a vice grip. And he said, what I was trying to tell you is that a piece of the respirator tubing had broken and was stuck in my throat. And you do know that I will kill myself before I go through that again. Do you understand me? And he wouldn't let go of my eyes, and my eyes started to tear up. And I said, I understand. I'm so sorry. I understand. And he looked at me and he said, good. So that stuck with me, that I needed to listen into people's eyes. The last story involves a young woman named Nancy. One of my mentors was a fellow named Dr. Edwin Schneidman. He was one of the pioneers in suicide prevention, and he was a source of referrals to me after I finished my training at UCLA. And he would refer me still suicidal people, but they had to discharge them from the hospital because you can't keep them there forever. So they weren't acutely suicidal. And they signed contracts, I'm not going to kill myself. But the residents, most of the residents really didn't want to see them. And I had been seeing Nancy for 6 or 8 months, and I wasn't making any progress with her. She rarely made eye contact with me. She would kind of look to the left or look to the right, but she wouldn't look at me. And in those days, I used to moonlight at a state hospital, Metropolitan State Hospital in Norwood, California. I would go there once a month, and I would cover for doctors, and I would admit new patients. And sometimes I didn't sleep. Sometimes I could be up 24 hours straight. And if you've ever been up 24 hours or 36 hours studying for a final exam, you know that you kind of get a little bit wigged out. So there was a Monday I came in after having been up for 36 hours, and there was Nancy. And Nancy rarely talked. Again, if you're me and I'm Nancy, she was like this. And as I'm looking at her, all the color in the room went away. It turned to black and white. It was like a black and white movie. It was weird. And then I got these chills all through me. I was just cold. I could almost feel them now. And I thought I was having a stroke or a seizure. So since she didn't look at me, I didn't think it was rude to do a neurologic exam on myself. And so I did that by sticking my finger out, this finger or that finger, seeing if I saw double, tapping this elbow to see what would happen with that. And she didn't look at me. And what I realized is I wasn't having a stroke or seizure. Then I had this crazy idea, because I kept getting colder and colder, that maybe I was looking out at the world into the room, feeling her feelings. And her feelings looked out at the world, and it was black and white and cold. And then I had this crazy idea. I was uninhibited. Maybe it helped me to be empathic. My colleagues would say, oh, you had a dissociative episode, and maybe I did. But because I was sleep deprived, I said to Nancy, I didn't know it was so bad. And I can't help you kill yourself. But if you do, I will still think well of you. I'll miss you. And maybe I'll understand why you had to. And I thought to myself, did I think that or did I say that? And then I realized, I think I said it, and I think I just gave her permission to kill herself. And I remember saying to myself, don't write that up in the record. And then at that point, she looks at me. I mean, she looks at me and grabs my eyes the same way as Mr. Smith did. And I thought she was going to say, thank you for understanding. I'm long overdue for another attempt to kill myself. And I said, Nancy, what are you thinking? And she didn't say that. What she said is, if you can understand how I might need to kill myself to get out of this pain that won't go away, maybe I won't have to. And then she smiled. And then the color in the room came back. And then the chills went away. And I said to her, Nancy, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm not going to give you treatments that have been tried before. And she'd been tried on everything. She'd made multiple suicide attempts before I had seen her. She'd been in the hospital multiple times before this hospitalization. And I said, would that be okay? I'm not going to give you all kinds of treatments unless you say maybe we should try a drug, maybe we should try electroshock therapy. And she looked at me like she was intrigued and as if to say, keep talking. And I said, as I held onto her eyes, what we're going to do is I'm going to find you wherever you are in the dark night of the soul. And I'm going to keep you company there as long as it takes. Because I don't want you to feel so alone when you're feeling that way. Would that be okay? And then she looked at me and her eyes watered with relief. So let me give you a little taste of surgical empathy. I often do presentations with a friend of mine, Jason Reed. His son killed himself 5 years ago, 14-year-old son. And he created a couple documentaries. One's called Tell My Story. That was one of his son's suicide notes. And that's available on, I believe, Netflix. And a more recent one is called What I Wish My Parents Knew. Because what he realized from the first documentary is that a lot of teenagers do not open up to their parents. And when we do presentations to parent groups, high schools, junior high parent groups, maybe some teens come along, what we mention to the parents is teenagers' main ways of expressing themselves is they blame, make excuses, make threats, and they're moody. Blame, excuses, threats, and moody. And when they do that, mom and dad, you get triggered. And when you get triggered, your teen doesn't think that you can understand them, that you react to them, and they don't understand that they have just triggered you. And this amazing documentary, What I Wish My Parents Knew, and there's now a version to go directly to the teens, these teenagers talk calmly about how they felt at their low points. And they talk about how they could never share it with their parents. Why? Because they were triggering their parents as opposed to telling their parents, Mom, Dad, I think I'm going crazy. Scared. And opening up in a vulnerable way. But most teenagers don't do that. And in the presentations, we also give 4 prompts. So if you're listening to this and you're worried about a teenager, or you could try it with a spouse or a brother or sister, do it when you're doing an activity, because most people can't stand, heart-to-heart talks that they don't initiate. And here are the 4 prompts. So imagine you're driving in a car or doing an errand, and there you are with your teen. And you say, a lot of us parents are worried because of the pandemic. And we're worried about how that's affecting you. And we're worried about all the shootings in the news and all those things. Can I run some things by you? Just help me feel better. And hopefully your teenager will say, okay, Ma, okay, Dad. And here's the first prompt. At its worst, how awful are you capable of feeling about your life or yourself? And they're going to go, what? Yeah, at its worst, how awful are you capable of feeling about your life or yourself? And if you're lucky, they'll say, well, pretty awful. So surgical empathy goes in, as I did with Nancy. And you say, pretty awful or very awful? Okay, very awful. And you get them to talk about that. Second prompt, when you have been feeling that way, how alone do you feel? Pretty awful. Surgical empathy. Pretty awful, pretty alone, or all alone? Okay, all alone. You get them to talk about that. The third prompt is, take me to the last time you felt that. And they're going to go, what? Or WTF? And you say, yeah, take me to the last time when you felt that way. Was it at 2:30 in the morning a couple nights ago? We heard you stomping around your room. And what's interesting is when they can describe a moment when they were feeling that way, very awful and all alone, when they can describe it so you can see it with your eyes, they re-feel it. As they're telling you, they re-feel it. So what happened at 2:30? Well, I couldn't get to sleep and I had a big exam. Yeah, I guess. Then what'd you do? I started just walking around my room and nothing seemed to help. And that's awful. Then what did you do? Well, I felt like kicking the wall or punching the wall. And then I started looking for some cough medicine or maybe sleeping pills, couldn't find them. Then what happened? I was going crazy. Then what? The sun rose and I felt better. So the fourth prompt is, I have a favor to ask you. It's more than a favor. It's a deep request. Whenever you're feeling that way, or even going down that road feeling that way, I want you to do whatever it takes to get your mom or your dad or my undivided attention. Because there's nothing more important than us helping you feel less alone when you're feeling that way and feeling so awful. And by the way, it's not a burden if you do that. If you happen to get older, which we think you'll do, and have children, teenagers, if they open up to you the way you've opened up to me, it's not a burden. It's a gift. It's much more of a gift than you're blaming, making excuses, threats, or being moody. And then, your dad or your mom or my reacting and really blowing it. So please do that. So I hope this is giving you an idea of at least one view of suicide prevention and how you can connect with people. Because when people feel felt, they start to cry, and they start to cry with relief, and they could be embarrassed. And something that I'll share is I have this terminal illness. A few months ago, I thought I was going to die a lot sooner than apparently I am. But I'm still not going to live as long as I thought. And I don't like people caring about me. I'm a doctor. I'm a therapist. I'm here to care about you. I don't want you caring about me. It's just who I am. But apparently there's more than a few people who care about me. And what happens is when I would be with someone who I sensed cared about me and they said, "So what's going on?" Rather than saying the usual, "I'm fine," I told them what was going on. And when I told them what was going on, I started to cry. And it wasn't like a boo-hoo crying. I was crying with embarrassment. I was crying because I felt vulnerable. I was crying because I felt relief. And I would apologize to them. And every single one of them, now I selected people who I guess in a sense I thought might care about me because I've probably been caring about them for years. And I will tell you, it's crazy. When I would apologize, they'd say, "Don't apologize." And they would say, "It's an honor that you just told us what you told us. That you were just so open, that you let your guard down." And some of them said, "This is the most emotionally intimate conversation I've had in a long time." And so far, close to 100%. And I'm talking busy people. I'm talking people who, if you reach out to them, you can never get a call back because they're so busy. But they know me, and apparently underneath their busyness, I guess they care about me. But close to 100% of them have said 24/7. And I said, "What?" They said, "You can call me 24/7. And again, I'm a little bit embarrassed about that. And I'd say, "Okay, thank you." And I'm sharing that, well, both because I'm letting all of you know where I'm at right now in my life, but I'm also demonstrating why it's so powerful when your teenagers just are open up and they're just raw. Now, I want to cap this off because a lot of people watching this are thinking, "Where did you learn all this? That doesn't sound like med school. Who taught you this? Who taught you to listen into minds, eyes, and souls?" Well, it actually did happen in medical school, but it wasn't because of a course. What happened is I had untreated depression in medical school, and I dropped out twice. And the first time they let you out, you're entitled, as long as you haven't failed, they let you out, they give you a leave of absence. And I was probably confused and depressed. I was highlighting every book in yellow, hoping I could hold on to it, and I couldn't. I take off a year, worked in some blue collar jobs, which I loved because my mind functioned at that level. And then I come back to medical school, and within a few months, it's back. And so I asked for another leave of absence. And what happens is I meet with the head of the school. The head of the school is about fundraising. And I don't even remember the meeting, but I can see that, that they might want to kick me out because every time someone took time off, they lost money. They lost matching funds. So I don't remember meeting with him, but I get a call from the Dean of Students, Dean William McNary. And the Dean of Students actually cares about students. It doesn't care about saving money. He or she cares about saving lives. And he calls me and he says, I have a letter from the main dean. You better come in here. And I go into Dean McNary's office and he says, read this. And the letter says, from the main dean, I've met with Mr. Goulston. We talked about other careers. I'm advising the promotions committee that he be asked to withdraw. So I was still miraculously passing my courses, but they wanted to cut their losses because, they were thinking, he's not going to be a doctor, so why lose more money on him? And I asked Dean McNary, our nickname for him was Mac. I said, Mac, what does this mean? And he said, you've been kicked out. And I think a miracle happened because when he said that, I cratered. He said it to me and I went, it was like a gunshot wound. And I know what that feels like because about 15 years ago, I had a perforated organ and I almost died from it. And I think what happened is I showed raw vulnerability. I think if I had said, they can't do that to me, how dare they do that to me? I'm passing everything. I didn't do any of that. I just cratered. And I think the raw vulnerability and the openness, plus during my first leave of absence, I had written a poem that got published about how we needed to care more for the elderly. So I think he read that and saw something in me that they didn't grade in medical schools. And he said to me, Mark, you didn't mess up because you're passing everything, but you are messed up. But if you got unmessed up, I think this school would be glad that they gave you another chance. And I start to cry. In fact, I thought I was bleeding from my eyes. It was tears, but I thought I just kept looking at my fingers like I was bleeding. And really what it was compassion for my vulnerability. And then he hit me with what I call the trifecta of hope, something that I paid forward and I think was instrumental in my helping a lot of suicidal patients. And here's the first leg of it. Mark, you didn't screw up, but you are screwed up. But if you got unscrewed up, I think the school would be glad they gave you a second chance. And then he said, because I'd be proud to know you. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Why would you be proud to know me? I'm a dropout. I can't make it. I'm a loser. And then he looked at me and he said, I'd be proud to know you because you have something in you, deep goodness that the world needs. And we don't grade that goodness. We assume students have it, but you got a deep streak of it. And you don't know how much the world needs that. And you won't know it till you're 35. So the first leg was unconditional love. You have something in you. You don't have to perform. You don't have to take a test. You don't have to highlight your book. You have something that is worthwhile. Second leg is you have a future. The world needs what you have. And then the third leg was probably the most profound one. He said, you have to make it till you're 35. And you deserve to be on this earth. So I'm not sure I was suicidal, but if I'd gone back to my apartment, it might have dawned on me. And then he said to me, and he pointed his finger at me, and he said, "You're going to let me help you." So the trifecta is he saw something in me that I didn't have to perform. It was just me. I didn't see it. He saw a future for me. 35, the world's going to need this. And the third leg is, you're going to let me help you. So he stood up, and he was just a PhD. He stood up to this group of MDs, the promotions committee, and he basically made a case for why they were going to give me a second chance. And I think that flicked a switch in me. I think I developed surgical empathy because Mac gave me a taste of it. And it saved my life. So I hope you've gotten something from this. I hope it, if you want to find out more, you can reach me at markgoulston.com. Although I must say, since I am kind of battling this illness, I think I'm good for a while, but I'm not sure how long I'll be good for. That's why I'm sharing stuff like this. So thank you for listening in, and take good care of yourself. And if you find this helpful, reach out to me, and I'll share some more that the universe is telling me to tell people like you. So take good care.